This whole process of photographing these skate parks, it's a contemplative and I might say meditative practice for me. I love this idea of the fact that these open, empty spaces are full of the potential to be used either by me as a photographer or by skateboarders doing what they do. Emptiness is not the same thing as nothingness. So emptiness and fullness need each other. They're dependent on one another. I grew up in a pretty rural part of Southern California called Beaumont. There were no concrete parks like this that were anywhere close to where I live. When I was 14, my best friend, his dad, and he and I built a big wooden ramp in his backyard. And that was kind of what kids were doing, is skating backyard ramps. And that was really the culture that I grew up in.
When Amir showed me this new body of work, I was just kind of really blown away. It's part of his general work of looking at the built landscape and kind of making what's familiar unfamiliar. So in this case, it was really interesting taking these skate parks. That's something that's really ubiquitous, throughout California, but making them seem like they're big sculptures or some weird utopian community or even like brutalist architecture that has kind of had a resurgent interest in the US.
When I was making the skate parks, at one point I asked myself the question, like, what are these spaces? What are these places I'm in? And I thought, well, they're not really an architectural space. They're more like a big empty vessel, like a big empty bowl. So I started there, and then eventually it led to me breaking some ceramic. And finally I just, photographed something that I broke and looked at just one piece, and I thought that it had everything I wanted.
Mostly I was interested in the destruction and creation. So for me, like, the difference between destruction and creation is a really interesting question to ask. I don't see much of a difference. When you destroy something, you're creating something. When you create something, you're destroying something. You can't have one without the other. So that idea was totally fascinating to me.
Destruction and creation, see?
In this exhibition, Amir has two bodies of work. One is called Concrete Vessels, which are the skate parks, and another is called Broken Vessels, which are the ceramic shards that you see. And what he's done is he's intermixed them within the exhibition so they're in dialogue with one another. They're not being used for their original utilitarian purpose, so you don't see any skaters in skate parks. And then with the ceramic vessels being broken, they can't contain anything anymore. This process, he uses what's called the gigapan. Each of the images could be composed from 30 to 70 images that are then stitched together. What that allows is that every, quote unquote, every inch of the image is in focus. But when you look at the broken vessel photographs, they're just a single shot, and there you can suddenly see the contrast where there's only one point of focus. When people come in, It kind of gives a little bit of a surreal sense, because oftentimes you think that they're paintings. Most people wouldn't necessarily know, about this kind of gigapan, process. So I think that that's one of the things that compels people to really look at the work and be curious about it.
I use a process that's a little bit complicated. I have a digital camera mounted onto a motorized tripod head called a gigapan, and I basically make many rows and columns of high resolution images. It may take 5 to 10 minutes just to go through the process of shooting one image. So normally I would be taking time in between each one of these to make sure the exposure and focus is correct. And like if something moves or something you don't want to be in the picture is going to come in, you can wait, and you can wait until it passes. Like if someone's in the way or a car passes by, then you can make the picture. But also surprises happen, like maybe a bird will fly through right when I'm in the right spot, and that's kind of a nice quality of this process.
I would say the exhibition as a whole, despite the popular culture aspect of the skate parks, for example, that really his larger intention is, I think, sort of visualizing, this sort of Buddhist philosophy. He's looking at this idea of emptiness. There isn't really anything empty per se. It's that emptiness allows for potential. It allows meaning for something else to kind of fill it. I think in the case of an exhibition, it allows for your imagination to sort of fill the space.
This way and that way, I tried to keep the pail together, hoping the weak bamboo would never break. Suddenly, the bottom fell out. No more water. No more moon in the water. Emptiness in my hand.
When I was approached by Tyler Stallings to do the exhibition, I visited the space and I thought it was laid out really open. I knew that I could do a pretty large, extensive exhibition. So my vision was really pretty open at the time. It was just, how do I interweave these two things? How do I make it very active space, but also leave room for their people to breathe and spend time with the photographs? My photographs are pretty quiet in a lot of ways. And I think that they invite a little bit of a slow read and people taking some time.
He doesn't use any glazing that is like plexiglass or glass when he frames them, and he does it on purpose so that people have the best experience of the work and kind of get immersed, within the detail of it.
A big part of this project has been the making of the book California Concrete. It consists of, I think, 72 photographs, all of the skate parks in California. The skaters get as high as they can go and they slap stickers, and so removing the stickers from the cradles was not an easy thing to do. That's the majority of the kind of post-production, is cleaning up things like that. I think they'd just be very different kinds of pictures if they had graffiti or logos or things that made people think about brands. I didn't want these. I wanted these to kind of be iconic and stand in for something that was more timeless than that.
I think he sort of found a very unique way to contribute to sort of skateboard culture and skateboard photography that I think there's definitely an appreciation for real aficionados about what he's doing.
In the 1970s, there was drought in Southern California. There's this idea that a pool, a backyard swimming pool, which has the function of swimming in and leisure, are being emptied out because of this drought. And skaters are finding a new use for them. They show up and they see the potential for them to be used in another way, in a way that they weren't being used before. And that idea of transforming this thing that's made for one thing into another by simply the draining of the water is a really kind of beautiful idea. When I photographed the skate parks, what kept coming in my mind over and over is a passage from one chapter of the Tao Te Ching, which is a classic Taoist piece of literature that's really influential for me. 30 spokes unite in one hub. It is precisely where there's nothing that we find the usefulness of the wheel. We fire clay and make vessels. It is precisely where there's no substance that we find the usefulness of clay pots. We chisel out doors and windows. It is precisely in these empty spaces that we find the usefulness of the room. Therefore, we regard having something as beneficial, but having nothing as useful. I come from a tradition of learning, someone who learned about modernist photography and is totally, I love a lot of this traditional photography that's really indebted to documentary and truth. At the same time, I'm, of a certain age where I learn digital technology and its capabilities, and I'm mostly interested in combining those two traditions. And instead of sort of this idea of settling for an image of the world as I find it, for me, I'm thinking about creating images that they manifest the world I desire.